All right, we are all set to go. We are currently streaming live on Facebook, Coalition of Black Student Achievement, and YouTube. Good night, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in to our continued series on our history, our culture. Tonight we have our presenter, Mr. Brian Knowles, that's going to bring some creative African American history. And as we get started, I am Latasha Clemens, the first vice president of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women, South Palm Beach County chapter. Traditional narratives have either been omitted or minimized the historical contributions of Black people. During this series, we will explore history of African people on the continent and throughout the entire diaspora. Together, we will implore dispositional shift, where our story stretch beyond an oppressive centered conceptual framework. At this time, before we get started, I would like to take a moment of silence to honor the ancestors, the named and unnamed victims of racism, as well as those people who put themselves in danger to keep us safe. Our medical personnel, our nurses and doctors and first responders. And also, we just had some mass shootings against Asian people here in Atlanta, Georgia. And we had a Boulder mass shooting in Boulder, Colorado. And I think it'll be very beneficial if we take a moment of silence to think about those victims. All right, thank you. At this time, we have Mr. Brian Knowles, our manager of Office of African American, Latino, Holocaust, and Gender Studies for the Palm Beach County School District. Take it away, Mr. Brian Knowles.
Thank you, Latasha. I appreciate that. So this is session number, 4 or 5 or something like that, this series. So thank you, Latasha, for the introduction and just, this whole series, and also Dr. Robinson. I don't think she'll be able to make it this evening to join us for this talk. But this series was kind of put together as an effort to kind of engage our community and making sure that we start reframing and rethinking the narratives of Black people and Black history. There's a lot of miseducation that takes place in our deficient educational system that either omits or marginalizes the contribution of Black people. And in honor of Women's History Month, we're already marginalized in our history. So when we talk about our history, we definitely we definitely see and witness the marginalization of women, even within a pocket of African and African American history. So yes, this is again presented by myself, the manager of the Office of African American, Latino, Holocaust, and Gender Studies for the School District of Palm Beach County. And for some of us who may have joined for the first time, this is an office that exists within teaching and learning, but has been existing within the school district for almost 27 years at this point. So thank you all for joining us. So just to kind of recap some of our past topics that we've kind of explored or just kind of dissected just a little bit, and going back to the month of November when we did our first one, our initial one called Rethinking the Foundations, looking at the foundations of African and African American history beyond just the scope and the parameters of oppression and slavery. Then we did one called Unpacking the Misconceptions and Myths of African and African American history, and also rethinking the legacy of Dr. King during the month of January, when we really looked at Dr. King from not the sanitized, whitewashed version of Dr. King that we get, or going beyond just the Montgomery bus boycott to the I Have a Dream Dr. King, but also looking at Dr. King as the radical revolutionary that he actually was. And last month, during the month of February, we talked about the great civilizations of Africa. We went into Africa and the thousands of years of African history. Foods that not just includes, but it goes beyond just the transatlantic slave trade. But we went back to the very beginning of civilization, to ancient Kemet. We talked about Kush, Aksum, the Ethiopian Empire, the Great Western Empire, empires of Western Africa, Songhai, Ghana, Mali. We talked a lot about Great Zimbabwe and some of the magnificent civilizations that existed on the African continent at one point. So just like I say, for this month, we're going to bring a special topic as we commemorate Women's History Month. We want to, and I wanted to call this recentering Black women in world history or just history. So just like I said previously, when we talk about just the entire scope of history, when we talk about people of color, specifically Black people in this particular space, we're always kind of left out or written on the margins of history when we look at the contributions of the Europeans as the center or the centrality of the development of human civilization. But now we want to kind of go beyond that. We need to kind of get to a point that we elevate and center the voices and the perspectives of all people involved in historical events. And as we start to pick up all historical events, we look at how it impacted and affected other people and how other people contribute to these events. And now we want to kind of take this space to really focus on Black women in particular when we look at these historical events. So I want to kind of start off with this quote to kind of really drive home just the importance and the significance of making sure that we honor, elevate the voices and the perspectives, the contributions of Black women to world civilization and society and world history. Malcolm X, during a speech in Los Angeles, 1963, Malcolm X would eventually become El-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz after his break with the Nation of Islam. But shortly before that break in Los Angeles, during a speech, he brought up just the marginalization and the misogyny and just the discrimination of Black women, and particularly the discrimination and just the mistreatment of Black women, even by Black men. And he quoted by saying, the most disrespected person in America is the Black woman. The most unprotected person in America is the Black woman. The most neglected person in America is also, again, the Black woman. So one of the ways that we need to make sure that we elevate the voices of our women and center the perspectives of women within our history, Black women in particular, is making sure that we when we discuss history and historical contributions, that we make sure that we include what our Black women have done, who have done immense work, bringing to the shaping of human civilization. So when we ever talk about the development of human civilization, the contributions to art, literature, STEM, world history, politics, it's very hard to really get the full scope of that if we're going to marginalize and leave out Black women from those narratives. It's insane because you'll see how significant and how important Black women have been to the development of just not here in the United States, but the development of the entire world. And one of the things that we must remember when we talk about an educational system, we talk about pedagogy and giving students an opportunity to see themselves in a positive light, we need to make sure that we give and provide that same opportunity to let Black children see themselves, but making sure that we see that Black girls have the opportunity to see themselves in a positive light. We really focus on a lot of pedagogy around improving outcomes for Black boys, who is the lowest performing subgroup, almost in any educational institution or system throughout this country. And sometimes as we lead that work, we neglect Black girls, which is extremely critical that we address Black girls who are going to mother Black men. It's a gateway for all, for our people to enter into this realm of existence is through our Black women. So we need to make sure that we nurture and cultivate that and nurture our women into womanhood by allowing themselves to develop a positive identity through the educational system by looking at themselves as positive contributors to history. Me as a parent, and particularly a parent to a young girl who will be a young lady at some point, this is significant in what I do through the daily basis, and making sure that she can see herself in a positive way, and making sure that she sees herself, and all young girls and boys and white, Black, whatever it is throughout our educational system, can see Black women in a positive light by understanding and even start to fully develop an understanding of the historical contributions of Black women and their contributions to world civilization and society. So one of the things I want to start off with is that when we saw the cover art, so I saw the flyer which was developed, and once again, a shout out to Jordan Barenberg from our Department of Communications here in the school district. And one of the people that was featured on it is Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. She was the 24th president of the country that we know as Liberia. She was a president from 2006 to 2018, and she was the first elected head of state on the African continent. And just a little bit of background on Liberia. Liberia was something that was founded with a combination of colonies and land grants through the American Colonization Society, which was founded in the earlier part of the 19th century as a potential homeland for emancipated enslaved Africans. It declared its independence in 1847. So as we fast forward into the 1800s, 1880s, we look at there were only two nations that retained independence after the Berlin Conference of 1884, when European nations pretty much carved the African continent and took control of the entire continent. It was Liberia and Ethiopia that retained independence throughout this whole process. So if you look at a lot of the people who live in Liberia, a lot of them weren't necessarily indigenous to Liberia. You will see a lot of Liberians who actually come from descendants of emancipated enslaved Africans here from the United States. Matter of fact, I look back in my own family history and I find that my great-great-grandmother, her brothers and sisters, after they were freed from slavery in Georgia, a lot of them ended up resettling in Liberia. So going back to ancient history, some of these names that you've come and joined us previous talk that you've heard before when we talk about Black women in antiquity, one of the most powerful women that ever existed in world history as a monarch was a queen that we know as Hatshepsut. She ruled Kemet from 1473 all the way to 1458, and we're talking about BCE or before Christ or before the Christian or Common Era. Unlike some other queens or that existed in Kemet or even other parts of Africa, she was just not just simply a queen or a woman that was married to a pharaoh of Kemet, but she was actually the pharaoh of Kemet. With henceforth why I say that she was probably one of the most powerful rulers or monarchs, of women monarchs in world history and African history. If we look at Luxor, look at some of the temples of Karnak, some of those different things that exist that you can still look at as a tourist site. If you go to the country known as Egypt today, it was actually those building projects were funded and led by Queen Hatshepsut. Then we go to Queen Ta'i, who was the grandmother to King Tutankhamun. She had a strong political role in Kemet, but she's most known for she's the second picture down on this slide. This is Queen Hatshepsut. This is Queen Ta'i, who's the grandmother of what we know as King Tut. Then we know as Queen Nefertiti, who existed and who was the mother of King Tut. Who existed and ruled Kemet from 1353 to 1336 BCE. And it was her bust that was eventually discovered, I think around 1913, which became the epitome of beauty. And it was epitomized what beauty was to women throughout this world. There's been some debate. And as we know, we're always Eurocentralizing history. I don't even know if that's a word, I just made up one, whitewashing history to an extent that we make people who are historical figures who were Black, and we try to create them to this image that they're white. But we know that Nefertiti, based on just the lineage, and even looking at who her lineage was in Queen Ta'i, that understanding that Queen Nefertiti was a Black woman. Then we get to Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, which we discussed in our previous segment when we talk about great African civilizations. She was the queen of an empire known as Saba, which actually was on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, which is a country known as Yemen. And that empire actually expanded across the Red Sea into Ethiopia at one point. And I know I shared the story last time. We talked about the Queen of Sheba and her visitation to King Solomon and how she became impregnated based on the Keeper Nagas, which is a holy book that is found in Ethiopia, originated out of Ethiopia, how she became impregnated with Solomon's son, who will become Menelik the first, and in some cases they called him David the second. And that's how the Ethiopians came into possession of what we know as the Ark of the Covenant. Then we always mention her, and I mention her all day long because she was an amazing woman. Queen Amani Shiketo, who was the Candace of the Empire of Kush. And she was the one who drove back the Roman forces when they attempted to colonize Kush. It was that Black woman who led an army to defeat one of the greatest empires that existed in human history, the Roman Empire. Then we get to Africa during the Middle Ages. And just to kind of give you historical references, when I say the Middle Ages, we're talking about a time period from around the 4th century AD all the way into maybe towards the end of the 15th century, what we call the Middle Ages. It'll be that time period that separates antiquity, ancient history to modern history. Then we have people like Amina, the queen of the Zazu from 1576 to 1610, who's pictured right here up top. After you had three immense empires that existed in Western Africa, we kind of went in this particular order: Ghana, Mali, and the last great empire, which was the largest empire in terms of geography, the Songhai. And all three empires were extremely wealthy and predicated a lot of their wealth on just the immense product of distribution and manufacturing of gold. And it was Amina, after we see the disintegration of the Songhai Empire, which eventually kind of disintegrated into small city-states, who was able to kind of consolidate power. And it was under her rule and under her military leadership that her city-state was able to consolidate power and start to develop, and not develop, but secure and create wealth once again in that particular region. Then we talk about Queen Azinga of the Ndongo of Mantamba, which is present day Angola. When we talking about, she's pictured right here in this color photograph to the bottom. And when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, we always have this narrative as if Africans willingly always participated in the slave trade. And that's one of those narratives that pins Black people as that slavery was something that we participated in, so therefore, henceforth, it's our fault. That issue was way more complicated than just, Europeans coming on the African coast and enslaving Africans, enslaving and selling other Africans to Europeans. It's much more complicated than that. Matter of fact, that'll take a whole nother session itself to understand how that trade evolved. But not all actually participated in what we know as the transatlantic slave trade or soul of the Africans. One of those people was Queen Azinga. The Queen Azinga resisted colonial or the influence by the Portuguese in her kingdom and refused to participate. There was even a famous story when the Portuguese came to negotiate a treaty with her, and how they would make sure to place themselves in a superior position, and they would, that the Portuguese delegate would sit there on the throne so they can sit higher than an African person. But Queen Azinga came in with her own personal bodyguards, soldiers, servants, and had them sit down so she can sit on top of them, so she can see eye to eye with that person that she was negotiating with. So that's Queen Azinga, and there's so much more to discuss about her. Remember, all of these talks, we got to cram and condense a lot of information within one session. So I kind of gloss over and just kind of give you general ideas of just the greatness and immensity and just the intricacies of African history in these talks. So I can't really get into a whole lot of detail, even though I would love to. Then we talk about Yaa Asantewaa, who actually was the ruler of the Ashanti Kingdom from 1880 to 1921. And she resisted British colonial rule. And she led troops who fought back and resisted just complete hegemony or domination by the British. So there was also something called the Golden Stool, which kind of was a symbol of power to the Ashanti people. The Ashanti people would be in present day Nigeria. So it was something called the Golden Stool that she refused to give up and surrender to the British. So she was able to defend that. She was even exiled at one point, where she died in exile in 1921, Yaa Asantewaa. These are some of the African women during the Middle Ages. There are so many. These topics that we pick are so difficult to kind of address within this little time frame of an hour. So I have to kind of just pick and choose. It's real difficult to pick who we're going to cover and highlight, because there are so many people. And you end up, as you start conducting research on these people, and I hope that some of you follow up and start researching some of this stuff, that it's going to kind of lead you down a rabbit hole, because we start to realize how much relearning that we have to do and how much unlearning we have to do, based on a Eurocentric traditional education that we've received, in our educational system. Another one, group of women that I would like to talk about is the Dahomey Amazons of the Minos. It was an all-female military regiment of the Kima of the Dahomey, formed in 1645. These were women who were tough in battle, and they were called the Amazons because of just when Europeans came in contact with them, it was just they kind of resembled the Amazons that we know, from the Black Sea, or what we know as Anatolia, which is present-day Turkey. The Amazons, like what you see on on that movie Wonder Woman and stuff like that, because of just their resilience and just how tough they were. Just the warriors, like you're talking about, all military regiment that females that were extremely focused and disciplined in battle. And you're wondering why. I may have some pictures from our feature films, like, for example, you have a picture here in the middle, Dora Milaje from the movie Black Panther, or from the comic book Black Panther. The reason why I put them there is because they were loosely influenced and directly influenced, matter of fact, from the Amazon Dahomey. If any of us have watched the series last year called Lovecraft Country on HBO, there was a series when one of the main characters, Hippolyta, was kind of traveling through time, and one of those portions of the movie were influenced by what we know again as the Dahomey Amazon. So you see them kind of pop up throughout popular culture. Actually, the last Dahomey Amazon actually passed away based on some research that I had in the 1970s, and she was well over 100 years old when she passed away. But you're talking about a huge historical mark in history that was led by Black women that is still with us today through movies like Black Panther and through shows like Lovecraft Country. Now we kind of fast forward to resistance to enslavement. Sometimes we think about resistance to enslavement, which African people did quite often, we kind of focus on men who led these resistance. But we really don't usually talk about the women who led massive resistance, because Black women have been tough throughout history for some of the different things that we've done and that they've done and contributed to. So the first one, and I've talked about her many times before, Nanny of the Maroons. Nanny of the Maroons is one of the Jamaican national heroes. Matter of fact, she's the only Jamaican national hero, and she's actually one of their currency notes. The Nanny of the Maroons led what we know as the Windward Maroons. In Jamaica, you had groups of guerrilla fighters who used guerrilla tactics, and these were Maroons who eventually escaped into it was kind of getting to like the Blue Mountains, for example, where the Windward Maroons live, in the eastern part of Jamaica. On the western part of Jamaica, you have something called the Leeward Maroons. And they went into like the highlands, into the thick bush, which made them kind of difficult to get to. What also worked in their advantage in a lot of cases, because the British could never defeat them. So they was like kind of seamlessly invincible to the British. And one of the leaders of the Windward Maroons was a woman or a sister known as Queen Nanny of the Maroons. Between the 1720s and the 1730s, she was responsible for possibly securing the freedom of over 1,000 enslaved Africans. Matter of fact, there are a few Maroon towns that still exist within Jamaica. And one of those is called Nanny Town, which is in the Blue Mountains, which is around Portland and Kingston in Jamaica. Also, when we talk about the Haitian Revolution of 1791, which was the most successful revolution in history, we always talk about people like Toussaint Louverture, but we still kind of marginalize the contributions of women. And one of those is Cecile Fatima. Cecile Fatima was a Mambo, which was what we know as a Boudan priestess. And she was the one, because the Haitian Revolution was kicked off by a spiritual ceremony. And she was the one who presided over that ceremony in 1791. She was the one that reportedly received visions and prophecies of this revolution being successful. And as we know, the reverberations and implications of the Haitian Revolution resulted in 1804, with Haiti being the first free Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. In addition to, because of that, French had stretched themselves so thin that the United States at that time doubled in size because of the Louisiana Purchase, which belonged to the French, which was sold to next to nothing to the United States government because of just that defeat that was handed to the British due to this badass woman. And these, you got to thank the woman for kind of sparking it and creating an influence and an inspiration and a courage for these men and women, because there were women who fought in that battle as well, to make this a successful insurrection. Also, one of the largest slave insurrections that took place in Cuba was led by a woman known as Carlotta. This is Cecile Fatima. This is Nanny of the Maroons here. Then we have Carlotta on the island of Cuba. In 1843, another tough woman who led a slave insurrection. We're changing that narrative and making sure that we center women within that narrative. And also, and I only mentioned Harriet Tubman here because I tried to avoid just talking about just what we call the usual suspects in history and the people that we heard about before. But I want to kind of bring Harriet Tubman into a different light. First thing, I purposely picked a young picture of Harriet Tubman that I found because we always, whenever we think Harriet Tubman, there's only like 1 or 2 pictures that circulate of her. And this is a younger picture of Harriet Tubman. Not only was she one of the people who helped enslaved Africans through the Underground Railroad, which everybody just kind of talks about, but she also served as a spy for the Union Army during the Civil War. When you're talking about holding this country together and one of the key contributors to the emancipation of slaves or African people, we need to kind of give credit to the Black people who fought in that revolution, in that war, in addition to all the countless slave insurrections that took place in the Southeast during that time period and throughout the country where slavery existed. And also, she was the only woman to serve as a commander during the Civil War at the battle of, or the raid at Hobby. I can't say it, so I ain't gonna even try to say it again. In 1863, she led 150 Union soldiers, and during that raid, they liberated over 700 enslaved Black people, Africans. Also, during the war, you had a lady known as Mary Elizabeth Bowser. She was a Union spy who was actually extremely intelligent. Read her story. Her story is extremely interesting. What happened is that she ended up actually living in Liberia at one point, came back, she wasn't happy with it, ended up getting a job as a servant, and eventually became a domestic in what we know as the Confederate White House during the Civil War in Richmond, so Jefferson Davis. What she did is she had immense acting skills. So what she would do is she played white folks as if she had a mental and social disorder. So they're discussing military tactics and all these secrets and so forth right in her presence. And what she was doing is taking it back to the Union Army and using this intel to eventually defeat the Confederacy during the Civil War. And that's one of those names we need to mention and make sure that we center her stories and contributions. And she's pictured right here beneath Nanny of the Maroons. Then we talk about the American West. We also talk about cowboys and so forth. And even when we talk about cowboys, we fail to even mention Black cowboys. And we definitely don't talk about Black women who are key to the development of what we know as the American West, great frontier during that time period, during the mid to late 1800s, or the mid to late 19th century. One of those people who had an incredibly interesting story, please people, look this up. Bridget Biddy Mason. Matter of fact, we know as the city of Los Angeles, which is the second largest city in the United States today, she was one of the first prominent citizens and landowners in the city of Los Angeles during the 1850s. The first church for African Americans was actually founded by her. She founded the first African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first AME church in Los Angeles. She didn't found a church itself. It was founded previously before her, but she set up the first one in the city of what we know as Los Angeles in 1872. She was a self-made millionaire and also philanthropist. She has a very interesting story. Matter of fact, she was born into slavery in a plantation in Mississippi, and her owner eventually converted into Mormonism. And with him being a Mormon, he wanted to move to Salt Lake City, Utah. And it's just crazy that, you know, you talk about Mississippi to Utah, we're talking about almost a 2,000-mile travel, that they use a wagon and they force her to walk behind the whole time. Utah at the point was still a slave territory, but eventually he ended up moving into California. And by this time, slavery was outlawed in the state of California. And she eventually petitioned for freedom, which she got her freedom. It was through numerous business ventures, because Black folks are resourceful despite slavery. Black folks are ingenious when it comes to things. We are self-reliant when it's necessary. So eventually she became a self-made millionaire and a philanthropist who set up elementary schools for Black children, shelters for Black children, and also as new settlers would come into the area, she provided resources, et cetera, with her wealth. Another one as well is Clara Brown, pictured right here in the middle. She was one of the pioneers that we know of the state of Colorado. And it was actually she was born into slavery herself. And I believe she was born into slavery in the state of Tennessee, from what I recall. In 1866, she established communities for formerly enslaved people. Right after, as you look at the date, 1865, we see the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which eliminated physical slavery or slavery without the punishment of crime. We know some of the language in the 13th Amendment laid slavery permissible even after 1865. But it was in 1866, a year later after the 13th Amendment, that she set up communities for formerly enslaved persons in the state. Another real dope woman to talk about in history is Mary Fields, also known as Stagecoach Mary, to another badass. First African-American woman to have a star route. Star route was independent contractors who would work for the United States Postal Services to deliver mail in far frontier areas, very, very rural areas. She was born into slavery at one point. I'm thinking Tennessee or Virginia. I'm sorry about it because I have so much information kind of floating up here. And eventually her owner would go to a nunnery or a mission in Montana, where she went to kind of nurse this owner back into health. And she lived in this mission, but because of her mouth and just excessive use of profanity and her toughness, they eventually didn't want her around anymore. And eventually she became a Starlight mail carrier. One of the things that you got to understand about the West during this time period, it was almost like this lawless frontier where it was extremely dangerous at some point. So mail sometimes would be ambushed by bandits and people who will rob not mail trucks, but stagecoaches or people carrying mail. So she carried that rifle, and she was a tough woman that delivered mail through to the frontiers of what we know as Cascade, Montana, in the towards the end of the 1800s. Very interesting story. A lot of these women have an interesting story. You look at Bridget Mason and also Stagecoach Mary. And I think there's some films, I think like Erykah Badu played her on like a TV show or something like that. And we see her kind of as a character in some of our popular culture as well. Now we're talking about civil rights in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, 19th century and 20th century. We can start off, and there's so many people to choose from. And I should say, I'm just going to highlight these three sisters. Elizabeth Jennings Graham. When we think about the Black women who refuse to give up their seats on buses and on public transportation, we just kind of always revert to just a single narrative of Rosa Parks, who was an amazing woman in history who did way more than just kind of not give up her seat on the bus. We've talked about her in one of the previous series, but we have Black women that have been doing that almost 100 years before that, literally 100 years before that. It was Elizabeth Jennings Graham who refused to get off a racially segregated streetcar in New York City. What happened is that they technically didn't have Jim Crow laws in the North, but you had private-owned railway companies and streetcar companies that enforced racial segregation. She refused to get off the bus, but she was forced to get off by law enforcement. And there was a case called Jennings versus Third Ave Railroad, which set the precedent, which eventually led to full desegregation of public transportation in New York City in 1865. So we're talking about what we know as the Rosa Parks story taking place with another Black woman almost 100 years before Rosa Parks. Another real amazing woman in history, Ida B. Wells. She was an activist and journalist. If we know anything about investigative journalism, she was a pioneer of that. When one of her friends in Memphis, Tennessee was lynched, and she went in and did some deep investigating of why Black men were being lynched so much. And the typical narrative that Black men were always being lynched for raping white women. And when she found out during her investigation that this was not the case, and a majority of those cases, it was other incidents, like street fights or refusing to bow down to white folks, etc., which usually led to real brutal lynchings. And when we talk about lynchings, and I don't want to get too graphic, but it was much more than that. So please do some independent research of what occurred during the lynching. She was also founding member of what we know as the National Association of Colored Women, and also the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And she was also one of the key campaigners for women's suffrage, which also leads us into Mary Church Terrell, who was also a founding member of the National Co-Association of Colored Women and NAACP as well. And she was also one of the people who campaigned for women's rights and suffrage. One of the things that should be pointed out and emphasized and highlighted about women's suffrage is that you had white women who wanted to campaign for women's rights to vote, but they didn't want Black women campaigning with them or even joining them in that fight. So you had Black women that had to kind of take up the mantle to not just to speak on the behalf of all women, but also speak on the behalf of Black women. And one of those women were Mary Church Terrell and also Ida B. Wells. So we talk about the modern civil rights movement. When we talk about the modern civil rights movement, we kind of have this real narrow box, and we talk about Dr. King. We may bring up Rosa Parks, and her story is limited. Dr. King's story is limited. Then we have Malcolm X, and we may have a John Lewis, and those kind of different pieces in there. And all of these people I mentioned shouldn't be minimized. Dope individuals, incredible individuals. But just like I said, we must start centering the voices and the contributions of Black women in these struggles just as much. One of those who is known as the mother of the civil rights movement, pictured here, September Clark. She advocated civic education and literacy for Black people in her citizenship schools. She was the one who helped fight for equal pay for Black teachers in the state of Carolina. She was the one who was going out into the rural communities and teaching Black people how to read, teaching them about government and civics. Actually, because you had these discriminatory laws that prevented Black people from being able to cast their vote, it was through her citizenship schools that she actually expanded Black vote, and a lot of Blacks became eligible to vote despite those laws and some of the things that she had been doing since the 1920s. Then we talk about lawyers, and we talk about the legal system and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Boy, we talk about, Thurgood Marshall and maybe Charles Hamilton Houston, again, incredible brothers. But yet we leave this sister out of that conversation, Constance Baker Motley, who played a critical role in desegregation. She was an attorney alongside Thurgood Marshall with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And she was the one who led the litigation to desegregate universities of Georgia, Alabama, and also Mississippi. As you see her picture right here with James Meredith. She was actually the first African-American woman to argue a case before the Supreme Court. And she actually, in those cases that she argued before the Supreme Court, 9 out of 10 of those cases, she actually won before the Supreme Court. She was also one of the major preparers and organizers and what we know as the Supreme Court case that's desegregated public education eventually desegregated public education, Brown versus Board of Education in May of 1954. Also, one of the key contributors to that case was a lady known as Mamie Clark. Her husband, Kenneth Clark, when they were partners, they were social psychologists. Usually when we talk about the Dahl test, we always talk about just Kenneth Clark, but it was also his wife who co-led their research on the impact of racial segregation on the development of the child development and also self-esteem and self-image of Black children. That infamous Dahl test that we know about, just like I say, we give all credit to Kenneth Clark, but his wife, who stood next to him, who did co-research that, co-led that research, should be mentioned in that as well. Now, we talk about the Montgomery bus boycott. We give, all credit and praise to Dr. King and some of the other people who should be given praise. But we must remember it was Joanne Robinson, pictured here, who was a member of the Women's Political Council of the WPC in Montgomery. She was the one who immediately started creating those leaflets and distributing them throughout the community and started what we know as the one-day boycott, the day after Rosa Parks was arrested in December of 1955, which eventually spurred into the Montgomery Bus Improvement Association, which led to a year-long boycott. But her name is usually left out of that narrative, and she was the one who pretty much spearheaded and organized it initially. Then we get to a woman that I just kind of even learned about in the last couple of years, Parithia Hall. Matter of fact, in 1962, she was from terrible Terrell County in Georgia, in southwest Georgia. Very rural part of the state, closer to the border of Florida, around Tallahassee. And she was actually shot at when she was wounded in her home. And a couple of days later, the Ku Klux Klan and the KKK burned down 2 churches in southwest Georgia. Dr. King came to town and they had a prayer vigil. And during that prayer vigil, she kept repeating, "I have a dream," in her prayer. And as she was having a conversation, as Dr. King was going back home, he asked for permission. Can he use that in his speech, which was delivered in the March on Washington, which was known as the famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which was actually directly influenced and inspired by this Black woman known as Parithia Hall, which should definitely be mentioned. So that's going to kind of conclude my talk today, and just making sure that we definitely start centering the voices and talking about the amazing things of Black women. And there's a whole lot of people I didn't mention: Elizabeth Freeman, Sojourner Truth, Maya Angelou, Anna, Julia Hayward Cooper, Madam C.J. Walker, Mary Bethune, Dorothy Height, Ella Baker, Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, Shirley Chisholm, Angela Davis, Miriam Makeba, Mary Pierce, Henrietta Lacks and her Immortal Cell line, and all the Black women who contributed to STEM. Right now we sitting in COVID, and there was a Black woman who was key to the development of that vaccine that y'all rushing out there to get. So the contributions of Black women are endless when we talk about our historical narrative. And we make sure that we just don't center the voices and contributions of Black women to Black history, but American history and world history. So thank you again for joining us, for all those who've been supporting us, some of us that are new, and some of us that may view this at a later time. We appreciate that. And Latasha, take it away.
Listen, man, that was so powerful. And, thank you for reminding us of the shoulders that we stand upon. Man, women are powerful and we are dangerous. We definitely appreciate that, Brian. There's a quote by Coretta Scott King that says, "Struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation." And I think that you've hit some highlights of all the women that have stood before us, even before our time, and we're continuing down that path. So exciting and informative, and I hope everybody out there has learned something from this dear brother this evening. Centering the contributions of Black women to world history. Women, don't forget how powerful we are. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and we will continue to do so. So, with that being said, thank you everybody for tuning in and joining us on this series, Our History, Our Culture. On behalf of Coalition of Black Student Achievement, Palm Beach County School Board, the National Coalition of 100 Black Women, South Palm Beach County Chapter, and the West Palm Beach County Chapter, and Unify. Thank you and we'll see you next month.
Right on. Thank you. Thank you, Latasha. Thank y'all. Peace.